Welcome back for Archaic Hoplites, Part 2, in which we discuss the evidence for how the Hoplite Phalanx was invented and perfected, such as it is. Spoilers, the answer is going to be, we don't know, we're not sure, we've got some guesses, but I'll take you through the evidence and tell you what we think currently. Before we do, though, we need to have a talk about art, because one of our best evidences for the early years of the Hoplite Phalanx, particularly in absence of a lot of written evidence, because the Archaic period is a period in which writing was just beginning to return to Greece, and not a lot of writing survives, and the kind that survives doesn't tend to have a lot of information we can use to figure out the answers to this question, namely how the Hoplite Phalanx gets developed. So we're using art, but just because something is portrayed in art, it doesn't mean that that's how people are actually fighting, especially when we're talking about military activity, because military activity is so bound up with ideas of awesomeness and badassery and the projection of power and also aesthetics, right? Even in the way that our military art works. We have some choices that are made for aesthetics that if you did them in the field would be a horrible idea. For instance, like anything in a Rambo movie. Very bad idea. Like people are perpetually flagging each other, that is, pointing the barrel of their guns at their buddy's crotch. Like, here's some very questionable military art today, and ancient people are still people. So we need to talk about the culturally specific phenomenon of heroic nudity, which is an actual term. You can Google it if you want to, but don't turn safe search on before you do, or don't, like, knock yourself out, but you're probably going to regret it. And spouse is making wisecracks now. Okay. The point is that just because something looks cool in art doesn't mean that this is how somebody literally went into battle. And here are some modern examples to prove the point. We have before us Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan the Barbarian in his nice little furry man bikini thing. We have the indomitable Wonder Woman. I actually love this movie, but this is not a sensible way to go dressed for battle. No matter how they try to market Wonder Woman's armor as functional battlefield armor, it is not. Particularly projections over the breast are a safety hazard that can cause, if you have an impact to your chest and you're wearing boob armor, it can smash into your sternum and stop your heart. It is very unsafe. Friends don't let friends wear boob armor into battle, okay? Like, put on a sports bra and wear a normal breastplate. That's sensible. Also, wear padding. If you put hot metal directly on your skin, you can burn yourself. I say this because I know somebody it happened to. She left her chainmail bikini on the riverbank while she was skinny dipping and then put it back on without thinking, oh, this has been in the sun, it might be hot. Don't let this happen to you. But it's not just the nudity aspect of heroic nudity that still shows up in our media. We also have some really stupid armor concepts showing up in video game art or other art too, just because it looks badass. For instance, on the right, we have somebody whose body is totally covered. It even has kind of a dendra panoply sort of look. But if somebody wearing this chest armor were to try to bend over, the plates would punch him in the gut and could theoretically cause a gut wound if he's not being careful. And like, there's one point that's aimed right at his groin that's making me very anxious. This is just not a sensible way to armor yourself. And the shoulder pauldrons are just ridiculous. And the helmet's helping a little bit, but if he tilts his head to the side and then raises his arm, he's going to shank himself in the neck. And there's some blood vessels there that are very vulnerable. My point is, art is not a reliable indicator of what's happening on the battlefield, and this is something that we're going to have to constantly keep in the front of our mind as we look at artistic images, trying to figure out how ancient battle worked. Just to bring the point home, here are a few more examples of some very aesthetically pleasing but poorly thought out battlefield looks. This is particularly a problem in women's fantasy armor, but just to be fair, we've got probably a cis dude. It's a little bit like Khal Drogo, but he's gonna spike himself in the cheek the first time he tries to lift his arm, and that underwear looks very uncomfortable. Do not recommend. Also, like, there isn't padding underneath the bottom edge of his greave, so that's going to cut into the top of his foot and can cause permanent nerve damage. Like, none of this is a good idea, is my point. With that in mind, we turn to our first bit of art evidence for the day, in which we have, as advertised, two heroically naked dudes facing off in an epic boss fight, which is what this is. This is from a classical Greek pot, so this is from the 5th century BC. It's a little later than our period, showing Achilles fighting against Hector in this final dramatic scene in the Iliad. And there are a few things that we'll start with from a cautionary point of view here. First, the nakedness is probably not reflective of real-world combat wear, although there are still some scholars who hold on to the notion that, yeah, Greek hoplites totally went into battle nude because of aesthetic reasons. However, the reasons why we think this is just an artistic convention are as follows. First, there are some circumstances in which people were verifiably naked, and that is in the Olympic Games. So in a friendly competition arena, when there were rules governing what you could and could not do to your opponent's body, and when there was an expectation that you would see the athlete's full naked form, and that was part of the pleasure of watching, they thought that the naked male body was super great to look at because that's their culture's aesthetic. In some ways, we've gender flipped this. In modern America, we seem much more comfortable looking at large swathes of uncovered cis female bodies than we are cis male bodies. In ancient Greece, it's the other way around. We see a lot more naked anatomical males than we see naked anatomical females. It's just, different culture, different rules. So that's the first thing that gives us a bit of pause, is these fellows are nude, but we have a lot of armor from this period, armor that seems to have been worn. It's got combat scarring, unlike, say, the Dendra panoply, suggesting that people were wearing armor in battle. And in those instances where Greek hoplites encountered people who were actually fighting nude, they got super freaked out by it, enough that it'll come up in the histories. For instance, Northern Europeans would sometimes rarely go into combat naked, and this was felt to be like super intimidating. Greeks were like, oh my god, somebody's actually naked on the battlefield. Oh wow, he must be super confident. This suggests to us that it was not normal to be nude on the battlefield. So that's the first thing that doesn't quite work in this art. The other thing that's a little hinky is the body positioning here. Hector is being knocked back on his leg that's just been wounded. You can see his thigh wound here. This is as it happens in the Iliad. But he's holding his spear, if this is a thrusting spear, in a kind of weird way. He's holding it pretty close to the gravitational middle, and he's also got his hand turned, if you look at it, I'm doing it with my opposite hand, this way, with his pinky facing forward and his thumb facing back. And I want you to pick up a broom handle, or here, I'll use a knitting needle for this, because why not? Okay, so here's my knitting needle. So here I've got my thumb pointed back at me, I've got my knitting needle pointed towards my enemy. If I try to stab forward, my arm wants to angle this blow downward because my wrist doesn't bend that way. This is a really awkward angle to stab somebody with a spear. Compare that to the way Achilles, the guy without the beard, is holding his spear, down low with his thumb forward, thrusting forward. If like you take your broom handle and stab this way, your arm is going to maintain a straight line, you're going to conserve the momentum, and you are going to effectively stab your opponent. This, however, seems less of an artistic problem and more a mixture of fighting styles. So Hector, we may be expected to read this as a javelin throw. Achilles with the underarm spear thrust, that seems to be a more typical attack stance. But these attack stances are chosen less because they make sense from a strategic point of view and more because they let us see more of the heroic nudity. Because keep in mind, again, our artist wants to display these nude fit bodies, both of them fitting very closely to this heavily policed male body standard with this six-pack ab thing and super cut groin area. And I'm really not going to go into too much more of an anatomical description of this because you can see. Both of these poses seem to have been chosen not for tactical reasons, but in order to display the peak physical condition of our two combatants at this very dramatic period in this famous fight scene. And this is going onto a piece of expensive pottery that's going to be displayed in drinking party contexts. This is from a wine mixing bowl where you'd mix water and wine when you were having a big party. So because this is a display piece, the artist is going to pick something that's going to look really nice and impress your guests. He's not assuming that we're looking at this so we can figure out how hoplite tactics work. Everybody in this culture knows how hoplite tactics work. So they're going to be able to say, okay, yes, some of this is artistic license, it's there because it's pretty, but no, we don't really fight like that. But for us, unpicking that's going to be a little trickier. Okay. So there are a couple things that we need to also learn from this image, technically speaking, and that is the anatomy of the Greek round shield used by a Hoplite Phalanx. So you'll notice that you can see the inside of Achilles and Hector's shield, but mostly Achilles' shield is the one we're looking at. This picture I've chosen because it shows you the inside guts of the shield and what makes this a little bit different from the round shields we've seen so far. We saw somebody desperately trying to make this kind of shield happen on the Pilos round shield in the Bronze Age, but this is the genuine article here. So instead of having a center grip where your hand is holding onto the shield at this middle point here, instead we have a porpax and antilabe. So the porpax is a metal piece that is attached to the inside of the shield along this vertical axis. The inside of the shield would be made out of laminated wood strips, maybe covered with a thin layer of metal, but this entire shield generally isn't made out of metal because that would be heavy and expensive, and also difficult to replace. Overlapping layers of wood also allow you to steam bend the surface into a dish-like area. So this is a concave surface on the inside of this shield with a rim going around the side here. And that rim's important because it lets you kind of hang the shield over your shoulder a little bit. The porpax secures it to your forearm, so you can keep your arm in this bent configuration like so, with the shield resting a bit on your shoulder, but also carried in the crook of your arm. Your hand holds it along a strap that's attached to the outside edge of the shield. This strap on the edge that your hand is holding onto is called the antilabe, which is a Greek word that means the counter grip. And you use this to rotate the shield upwards and downwards across your phalanx's shield line. So you can use this to make a very maneuverable cover that lets you cover more of your body than the shield area allows. This lets you get the kind of coverage that you'd want from a tower shield with the lack of weight fatigue that you get from an arm strap rather than a center grip. You can also see that there's, and I'll choose a different color here, let's go for green, there's a lighter string that's attached at points around the edge of the shield. This is so that you can hang it on your wall or hang it on your back as you're marching, so this is a convenience thing. It's not part of how it's used in combat. You can see also Hector's Porpax, his antilabes off of the screen, but you can see that he's got it up against his shoulder a little bit. I mean, he's knocked back, so he's losing his grip, but you can see how it's fitting very closely to his torso. The lower edge goes down far enough to cover you to the groin, the upper edge covers you to your nose, and then it's got enough breadth to cover your shoulders. This is a very efficient way of covering your body. But then, here with the red line, this, sorry, it's this edge of the shield, so the part that's hanging off your elbow, it isn't covering much of your body. That is going to be overlapped with your neighbor's shield so that you can create the shield wall, and I'll show you that in a better image later. Okay, so Porpax, antilabe, and then we call the shield a hoplon, and it's this shield that gives the warrior his name. So a hoplite is a warrior using this round shield with an arm strap with a Porpax. This term hoplon in the plural, hopla, is used to refer to your entire battle kit. So your greaves, your helmet, if you have a breastplate, your breastplate. But just in the singular, it's your shield. The most crucial bit of this gear is your shield. Because your shield doesn't just cover you, your shield covers your neighbor, both your literal neighbor, because you're a citizen army, so like Fred from down the street is going to be standing next to you when you're fighting, and your shield is not just for you, the edge of your shield is covering Fredikos, because we're in Greece. Now, I've saved this next piece of equipment for this slide because here it's going to get very complicated identifying this when we're looking at it in art. Because there are two different kinds of spear, broadly speaking, used in ancient combat, any combat for that matter. There is a thrusting spear, and that thrusting spear is called a doru in Greek. So that's the term I'm going to use for this. This is handheld and repeatedly thrust into your enemy. You never throw it, you try not to let go of it. You might have a backup in case it breaks, but this is your major offensive weapon in close combat. A javelin, however, is a spear that's meant for throwing. It's a one-shot weapon that's used entirely to make a ranged attack before you close for close combat. And it's very difficult to tell which one you're looking at in ancient art, because often the scale is very small. They're not able to show the slightly thicker girth of a thrusting spear, a doru, and a javelin tends to be a little thinner because you're throwing it. It needs to be lighter. It's got a smaller point. One of the things we can look for when differentiating between the two is the center of gravity. When you're throwing a spear, you balance it at its midpoint and then launch it. When you're thrusting with a thrusting spear, you tend to grip it further back on the shaft. So if my friend the knitting needle, which is big enough to fit into my camera range here. So here's my knitting needle. If I'm gripping it at the center, and that's the center here, this gives me a good midpoint balance so that if I'm throwing it like a dart, I'll maintain accuracy for the flight path. But if I want to stab somebody with it, I want to maximize the range of my stabbing, right? And I also don't want to have too much coming off the end because there are people standing behind me in the phalanx. If I pull backwards and I have like a huge long spike behind me, I'm going to stab the person behind me in the face or the shield or, God forbid, the groin. So you don't want that much extra on the back. You want to maximize your front reach. And therefore, when you're holding a doru, you're going to hold it towards the back end. You're going to keep the longer area pointed frontwards so that you can reach out beyond your round shield and stab a dude in the face or sometimes the waist. There's a lot of disagreement over where you're aiming to thrust at. The most likely candidate, I'm going to go with Chris Matthew on this, who wrote the most recent book on the topic of hoplite combat. He argues convincingly for me that most of the time you're aiming not for the face, which is pretty well defended in hoplite gear, but rather you're aiming for the groin and the upper thigh for just the same reasons a boar is aiming at it. A lot of blood vessels, very vulnerable, and you can put somebody out of commission very quickly if you stick a spear through their thigh. Now, one other thing we can look at when we're trying to figure out if we're looking at a doru or a javelin is the thong. So in order to improve the range on a javelin, Greek athletes and warriors would take a piece of leather and wind it around the shaft of the javelin. So you can see it here in this illustration where this one long continuous piece of leather has been spiraled around the shaft and then is finally attached to the two fingers that are facing backwards when you're throwing the javelin. As you let go, this string will unwind and it will cause the shaft of the javelin to rotate in a rifling motion. This makes it fly longer, faster, and more accurately so that you can launch your spear to good effect into the enemy front lines. Sometimes you can see this in art. I've chosen a somewhat unambiguous example here where we have a young athlete who's preparing for a javelin toss event, and you can see the lines of the throwing thong already wound across the shaft of the javelin. But this is really subtle, and sometimes you can't see if it's there or not. Often an artist just won't paint it in because it clutters the image, it's not necessary, it kind of gets in the way. So sometimes it's very difficult to tell whether we're looking at a javelin or a doru. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's look at a few ambiguous examples. We're going to start on the right-hand side of the page here, where we've got a heroically nude young guy preparing to throw and or stab a spear, a doru or javelin. Now, he's holding it in the center of gravity more or less, although it's hard to tell because the end of it seems to be hitting his bro in the shoulder. Also, this might be his assistant because he's carrying a bundle of what appears to be more javelins. He's balancing the point in one of his hands. He's not got a shield. This suggests that we're in an athletic competition, but you can't see a thong on this, can you? It's just this shaft and it's in his hand, and he's got his thumb facing back, which is what we expect in a javelin toss. So probably this is a javelin toss, but it's not case closed. Similarly, on a piece of artwork we're going to look at closer later, the Chigi Vase, there is a group of hoplites who are putting on their gear really fast to run into battle. You can see the inside of their hoplon here with the Porpax across the center, and you can see the overlapping wood that makes up the inside of the shield, which is quite nice. And then there are these two spear-shaped items stuck into the ground, each of them with a little loop on the side. You can see right here the loops. So these are likely extra javelins that are standing by ready to throw as this army runs into battle. There are a lot of contexts other than combat in which we see armor, so we have to be careful when we see armor in Greek art that we're seeing it in a combat context. For instance, there was one event that was common at ancient games, including the ancient Olympics, called the hoplitodromos. Dromos is the Greek word for a race, and hoplito, we've seen this one before, right? This is your hopla, your armor, your gear. This is a race in armor. It grew out of a military tradition in which you would train to run in your armor as part of a charge and stay in formation when you did it. But as an individual, you could also compete in an armed race. So when we look at a vase painting, we may be looking at an army charging, or we may be looking at the hoplitodromos, the race in armor event. This, I think, is likely to be an image of a hoplitodromos because the formation isn't staying consistent. There's this big gap in the shields, which is tactically bad, but great in a race because somebody has to win. Now, this might be from a phalanx, though, because everyone is leading with the same leg, so they do seem to be running in time. So maybe this is an artist trying to show like two ranks of a phalanx on the very limited space on the jar. But the way they're holding their spears, down in an undercarry, we see this in attack blows, but not necessarily running in combat. So this is like, I'm 75% sure this is a hoplitodromos, but it could also be a phalanx, and scholars have argued for both ways of viewing this. So this is something else to keep in mind with ancient art. Here's another image where it's not immediately apparent whether we're looking at a hoplite phalanx, so a combat formation that's running in step with each other. They do seem to be going forward on the same leg. Their shields are all lined up really nicely. Their spears are in a carrying position, but this could also be a race in armor that we've just made look super regular, so it looks pretty on a vase. It's ambiguous, but I'm, again, 75% sure that this is a running charge because of the way the shields are lined up. This is a really good shield wall, and their spears are in an efficient carry position. These are with the very long blade. That's probably a doru. I don't see a javelin, but that might be because they've already thrown their javelin. Their spear is ready to be used in combat when this line meets the opposing line. Another thing about these shields that you can see from this image is that each one has a different animal on the front of it. You've got a crab, a European lion, a fig leaf. This guy's got a deer, a boar, somebody's head. This wouldn't be standardized. No matter what you see in Spartan fan art, the big lambda on the shield isn't typical of Spartan warfare in the Archaic period either. Each family has their own shield with their own shield art, and this is customized for your family or for your personal reputation. So if you were making your own shield to go into combat with, you could choose how to present yourself, and this is the part of you that's customizable. So that even though you're fighting in a unit with shared glory and shared cooperation, you still get a little bit of glory because people can see like that Crabman just killed 2 Persians. Go Crabman. Okay, so to the hoplite phalanx question. There are several things that we need in order to identify a formation as a hoplite phalanx. The first hint is in the word hoplite. The word hoplite is derived from the hoplon, the round shield with the Porpax attachment across the forearm. A soldier fighting with a hoplon is a hoplite, but that's still just one soldier. When you have multiple hoplites standing in a shield wall with their shields overlapped like these are, you can see them making a kind of scale formation across the front of the battle line. That is the phalanx. So a phalanx is a line of people in formation. A hoplite is somebody fighting with this iconic round shield forearm strap. The final thing that we look for when we're identifying a group of soldiers as members of a hoplite phalanx is the doru. Are they using a thrusting spear that will allow them to attack while maintaining this overlapped shield formation? Because when your shields are overlapped like this, swords aren't a great way to attack. You kind of can't reach above and below. You're going to hit somebody when you move laterally. So while they are wearing swords, the swords are for the end stage of battle when you've broken through the enemy line and you're in the cleanup phase. Your sword is your personal protection. The thing that you're using to make your initial attack is the spear, because the idea is you march forward in a continuous line, you keep your shields overlapped, and the effort of keeping your shield properly overlapped will often, if you haven't practiced a lot, cause you to drift toward the right. So as you march forward, then you use the long reach of your thrusting doru, your spear, to either stab low beneath the curve of the shield in this bottom slot here, or to snap up and stab high here, like so. And you don't have a lot of room to maneuver your spear either, so you need to do this without hitting your neighbors, hitting the person behind you, or smashing your spear into your shield, which is a little bit tricky. If you're feeling frisky, maybe you'll want to try this with like a garbage can lid, duct tape it to your arm, and then try stabbing differently with your spear to see how this works. And you'll get a sense of the limitations on your range of motion introduced by fighting in this kind of formation, a phalanx with a hoplon or a hoplite phalanx. Now, there's also cavalry in this period. There are people who are riding horseback using longer spears to fight, but there aren't a lot of them, and they aren't the most tactically effective option for mainland Greece. There isn't a lot of room for cavalry to maneuver. Horses require a lot of upkeep and food. So your infantry, where you're in a close formation and blocking a narrow pass, is your go-to method for defending your city-state, because they do what you need to do. That is, block the narrow pathways between mountains, so that if somebody's army is coming to grab your crops, they're not going to get through the pass. Okay. Now, I mentioned that we do have armor from the Archaic period other than the hoplon and the doru, and here's one example of this. This is an archaic panoply. So the word panoply is a compound of the Greek word pan. It's the same root that gives us the pan and pansexual. That means all, every. Oply has lost the H in hoplon, so this is the panoply. This is all of your gear together in an assemblage. Your panoply is the entirety of your kit that you wear into battle. This is why we call the dendra panoply the dendra panoply, is that it's a full set of gear. So here's an archaic panoply and some excess belly guards. I got this set of pictures from our last ancient studies trip to Greece. These were taken in the museum in Crete. And this is a particularly nice example showing a full surviving archaic cuirass, is the word for armor that covers both your back and your front. You've got enough vocabulary for this week, so I'm not going to make you learn this, but it's going to come up again when we move on to Rome. Now, this particular breastplate and backplate, this cuirass set, covers all of the torso down to the waist. It stops where you need maneuverability, and also it allows the weight of this chest piece to be carried by the hips. It's also very tiny. If you put a UMBC student next to it, only a really small person is going to fit into this. It's about the size like a modern 12-year-old would wear, because there is food insecurity. People aren't growing as tall or as big, so you do need smaller armor for this period. It's very unusual that you get a very big person, let alone a big person who can afford that much bronze for armor. So this would have been a very elite person's armor set, and it seems to be the case that not everybody could afford this full breastplate. This is just for very fancy warriors. Your shield was your basic first line of defense that you absolutely needed, because your shield's for you and your buddy, but any additional armor that's just for you, and if you can't afford it, well, you don't get it, because you're paying for your own armor. Now, the fancier you get, the more you can personalize your armor, and one of the advantages of growing and increasing income inequality and stratification is that the closer you are to the top of the social heap, the more wealth you have, the fancier armor you can afford to have made, but also because wealth begins to stay in families and you get hereditary wealth. Once you've made this fancy kit of armor, you can hand it down to your child and their child and their child. So once the armor's in the family, it stays in the family. Rarely does it end up in graves, because this is useful stuff. You don't bury it unless it's just too old and unusable. Or if you're trying to make a point to the gods. So we find this armor often in contexts where people have dedicated it to a specific god. This is a part of the religious infrastructure of battle during this period. If you wanted to live through a battle, you would promise the gods that if you make it through this alive, you're going to take your armor and dedicate it to the god at their temple at fill in the blank. And that's one of the contexts where we find this armor. But it's not just your armor that you'll dedicate at the temple of the gods either. You might say, if I slay my enemy in battle, I'm going to dedicate his armor to the god. That's the more usual scenario, and that does seem to be the situation. Sometimes we'll find an inscription on the armor that will say who dedicated it and whose it was. When we get into foreign wars, we can tell that this was captured armor because it'll be like Persian armor in a Greek temple. That doesn't mean that a Greek dude was wearing Persian armor. This means that you killed somebody, looted their body, and put the stuff in the temple. Looting is a normalized part of warfare now as it was back in ancient Mesopotamia. This is going to be the case for all the military history we'll be looking at in this course. So this isn't a shameful thing at all. This is a regular perk of going to battle, is that you can yoink somebody else's armor and use it to fill out needs in your own kit. So as I said, this is the cuirass, the front and the back armor, and it laces up at the sides, so there are ties and buckles where you attach this. It's got a little bit of a flange to protect the neck, and then the helmet goes all the way down to the shoulders a bit too. So the chin is here, your nose is here, and often there will be a little flange at the front here protecting more of your face. This particular kind of helmet form, where the metal curves all the way around, it's in one piece, and the neck piece is attached to the cheek piece, is attached to the head piece, and there are no hinges or anything. That's called a Corinthian style helmet, named after the city-state of Corinth, which sits right on the isthmus between the top of mainland Greece and then that bottom dangly peninsula at the bottom. There's this little narrow strait of land. That's where Corinth is. We'll come back for them when we talk Peloponnesian War. Now, either connected to the bottom of the cuirass through a kind of strap or connected to your cloth under armor is a so-called belly guard like these. You can see there are these holes on the edge that would be used to attach leather padding or cloth padding. And these were put down low as a protection for your vulnerable groin area, but also for your lower abdomen. Because if you'll notice, this cuirass doesn't cover the entire abdomen. It stops at the waist level. And if you get a spear thrust to your lower abdomen, that's super vulnerable. Your intestines can fall out. The infections there are quite nasty. You do not want to get a gut or groin wound. It's very difficult to heal, even if you don't bleed out immediately. So if you can't afford the full cuirass to cover your upper torso, you can at least afford a plate of bronze to cover your groin and lower belly area, and that's what these pieces are for. Now, some of them are quite fancy, and that might be because they were found in a temple dedication. So these might just be fancy armor pieces that were bought for the sole purpose of dedicating them to the gods, or they may have been working pieces of armor. When we find armor that's been damaged from attacks, the damage tends to be along the lower torso. So here, we think this is one of the areas folks were aiming for in kill shots, or in the soft underbelly in this area where the groin protector is. Here's another very important set of armor. In fact, this and the helmet tend to be the first bits of armor you buy when you can afford it. And then only if you're super fancy do you buy the torso armor, the cuirass, the belly protector. This is because your shins are exposed below your shield, and the shins are very vulnerable. Your flesh isn't very well padded. There isn't a lot of muscle between the skin of your shin and the bone. So if you get sliced or stabbed in your shin, it can quickly become an infected wound that eats into your bone, that causes structural instability in your leg. It's super painful, and also it's an easy area to break. The bone that goes down the front of your shin, the tibia, breaks pretty easily, much more easy than your femur does. So if somebody wants to put you out of commission, using the bottom edge of the rim of their hoplon and bashing it into your shin is a good way to put you out of commission if you haven't put on your greave. So this shin armor, this top of your knee to the top of your foot, is a standard piece, and often they're made out of a single piece of bronze that can be bent around the lower leg. There's usually a place for them to be laced onto some kind of an under padding, but often the metal itself seems to have been bent around the leg like a clamshell and clamped into place. So this would fit very tightly onto your foreleg. So tightly that we find some pairs where one is bent a little bit more than the other because one leg is slightly fatter than the other. This is pretty typical. Your dominant leg tends to be a little meatier because the muscle is more well developed there. And if you're doing a lot of javelin throwing, you overdevelop one of your legs over the other because one leg is the leg that you're pushing off on. There's a second set of greaves here on the side showing you the inside of a pair of greaves where the bronze was hammered. These have all been heavily reconstructed. The little flakes, that's original pieces of bronze. In the back is a little bit of conservation putty that's been used to put them back together. And you can see along the very top edge of this greave some little holes. Those are the lacing holes that are used to sew the padding onto the back of the greave. Now, as I mentioned, you're not necessarily wearing this kit right up against your body. In fact, you aren't. You don't want to wear armor without any padding because that padding is part of what's absorbing the shock of blows. The flat surface of the bronze is going to stop the biting edge of the weapon, but the force is still going to transfer into your body. And that force, if it's not dulled, it can break ribs. If the metal of your armor buckles, it can cause it to buckle and then pierce into your abdominal cavity. It can rapidly become very uncomfortable. So you want there to be some padding and some space between your armor and your body. You don't want it to be too loose, mind you, because you want your body to carry the weight of it well. So you need a good balance between fit and pad. And the way this was accomplished with ancient Greek warriors was through very loose tunics. You can see them in action here. So this very crinkly texture in this fellow's tunic. You can see it really well in the folds of this tunic. This is made out of wool. See it really well. This guy has a stripe woven into his tunic, and it's making it kind of kilt up where it's been gathered in. So this very large tunic is put on underneath your cuirass and your other armor bits. And the folds are going to create these dead air spaces and padding between you and your armor. And then when you take it off, it's going to unwind again and become this very blousy, porous material that's going to shed sweat really quickly. So at the end of the day, you'll put this is made out of either linen or wool. You'll put it out to dry overnight, dry, and then when you put it on again, it'll be lofty for the next day's worth of fighting. Eventually, it's going to smell rank, but it's going to do what it needs to do and pad your ribs against the force of blows. See, anything else I want to say about this? Nah, that's enough for now. So on to helmet types. The iconic helmet used in Greek hoplite phalanxes in the Archaic period, and the earliest one that we see coming out of Greek city-states, is the Corinthian helmet, as I mentioned before. So this is all one piece, taken from a rounded bit of bronze that's been hammered onto a wooden form in kind of a vaguely like peg head shape. So you hammer this out so that it encloses the whole head, and this covers the ears completely. There are some good points to this and bad points. So covering up the ears means that you don't have a part of your body that can be chopped off, which the ear has a tendency to get chopped off very quickly if you don't protect it in battle. But it also means that there's a layer of bronze over top of your ear. Now, padding is going to help with this effect a bit, but if somebody clocks you on the head, if you get bonged on your helmet, this thing is going to ring like a bell, and over time it's going to cause hearing damage. When it happens to you on the field, if somebody rings your bell, this is still an idiom used by people who fight in armor, it causes this reverberating sound that can stun you momentarily so that you can lose your fighting stance. It can also over time cause traumatic brain injury. In fact, football helmets still have this problem. They'll protect your skull to a point, but the repeated bonging damage you get from blows to the helmet can over time cause both hearing and brain damage. But all that aside, this protection is going to be considerable in the short term. It's covering all of the vital parts of your face, and when there's a curve of shield here, this creates a double layer of protection right where you need it, in your neck, where you have vulnerable blood vessels. I've included this tombstone from Thebes so you can see how this might have looked like in a period where the padding was still in the helmet, because the padding is rotted, of course. But you can see here, this fellow's helmet has a kind of soft underlayer that's been tied closely around his face. And he's carrying both a thrusting spear, the slightly longer spear here, the doru, and then this shorter line here is likely his javelin. So finally, on to the Chigi Vase, or Chigi Vase. This is a find that is our earliest firmly identifiable instance of a hoplite phalanx working in ancient art. It dates to about 650-ish BCE, and it was found in Italy, not mainland Greece. So this is in Etruria. It was likely made in mainland Greece and then exported. There was by this point, a lot of Greek-speaking colony states in Italy and a very active trade in vases and finely decorated implements. So the actual Chigi vase, you can see here the whole thing. So this is a wine pouring pitcher that would have been used at aristocratic parties. On the top register, it shows an infantry phalanx in formation marching, so up here. And here at the bottom, it shows cavalry and somebody in a chariot. So it's, especially on the bottom part, it's not immediately clear whether this is an active fighting formation or if this is a military parade of some kind, but the top register does seem to show an active combat unit in a hoplite phalanx. And let's count off, shall we, all the components of a hoplite phalanx we can see here. Okay, so the first thing we need is the hoplon, a round shield attached to the arm with a porpax. And everybody's got a round shield, round shields attached to the forearm. You can't really see the porpax on this guy, but we can on some of the other figures here. And the way he's holding his hand, the elbow is near the center, and then he's got a fist gripping near the rim on where the antilabe would be. So porpax, antilabe on a hoplon shield, on this round dish-like shield. You can also see the layers of wood really well on the inside edge, which is nice, and you can see the painted outer layer on this phalanx. Okay, so there's our hoplon. The next thing we want to look for is the thrusting spear. So here, let's look at this one spear as it goes through this guy's hand, and that's protruding out the other side. He's holding it towards the back end of the spear, and he's got it like up over his head and kind of like this awkward thumb back grip, but he's holding it. It's That's probably a doru. You can see the opposing phalanx has not just the thrusting doru, but also there are these other sticks sticking out down here. This is likely their backup javelin. They haven't thrown all of their javelins yet, so they're carrying them slung from their belts, assuming they have belts. And then you can also see the third thing we look for in a hoplite phalanx is the overlapping shield formation. So they've got a hoplon, and they've got all of their gear, and they're lined up with their shields overlapping in a phalanx formation. And we can also see the tactics at work because it's not just one line. These are two opposing lines coming together in the center. So the idea of a hoplite phalanx is that both sides march against each other, and then they play something a little bit like a game of Red Rover, where you try to smash your way through the weakest point in the opposing shield wall by either killing one of these guys or several of them, causing a gap in the line, and then you try to press through that gap before the line can form up back into a formation. So it's a little bit like a rugby scrum while you're stabbing them with your thrusting spear, your doru. And that's what we see here. Behind this first line of the phalanx, see this guy? I'm outlining him in blue. This is an Aulos player. An Aulos is a double-reeded instrument that it's a little bit like playing two oboes at once, only it's a very squawky oboe, super loud, like really loud. It's like the aggressive battle call of an irate goose. I'll put an example into the course playlist so you can see what I mean by that. And this is how the hoplite phalanx kept on rhythm. Brass instruments are a Roman thing. Ancient Greek hoplite phalanxes used the aulos. So the aulos was a wartime instrument, but it was also a party instrument. It was very loud, though. You'd use it to kind of disorient your party guests with super loud, thumpy music. So let's see. Other things to say about this. This is a nice representation of hoplite warfare because there's no heroic nudity. Not just no heroic nudity, but the tunics have been tucked up into the bottom edge of the cuirass here, possibly with a belly protector. There's a little round shape here that might be a belly protector. So this shows us that not only are they wearing this tunic to protect their body and create padding, but they're tucking it up so the edges aren't flopping around and getting in their way, and also provide a little bit of support to anything that may be dangling down below, as it were. They've got their nice Corinthian helmets on, all in one piece, and they've still got the combs attached on the comb slots, so you get these nice crests. And then each one has their own fancy shield, because these are fancy upper-class warriors who can afford nice armor. So this is a wonderful piece of art. Our firm start date for the hoplite phalanx is a fully formed battle formation. And it's pretty early. 650 is right near-ish the beginning of the Archaic, especially if we start dating the Archaic closer to 700 CE than 750. It's there. So this leaves us with the chicken and the egg question. Did the round shield arrive first, and then these tactics evolve to support round shield walls? Or did the phalanx tactic start first, and did the round shield's grip structure and architecture develop to fit this style of formation fighting? This we have no idea. We don't know. We can't prove it from the art existing. We see phalanx formations as early as 2500 BCE in Mesopotamia, so they've been around for a long while. Round type shields show up pretty early too. Both of those are available to the Greek mainland right at the start of the Dark Ages. So the Dark Ages are a bit of a black box. We don't know the steps that led to this particular style of fighting. We're interested in the question, though, because this ends up being one of the most effective ways to fight. It's the dominant way of fighting in the Mediterranean for the next couple of centuries. And until the Roman legion begins experimenting with maniples and tower shields again, this is the way that you achieve success in the field, with a few variations that we'll get into later. So yeah, no satisfying answers here, but the questions are important to know about. Now, I mentioned there were other kinds of helmet in use with hoplite gear and tactics other than the Corinthian helmet, and here's one of them. This is the Chalcidian helmet. These tend to come along a little bit later than Corinthian helmets, and they require more complex bronze working. For instance, they need to be strong enough to accommodate this ear gap, but without losing structural integrity. They also have a little bit thicker bronze on the top of the helmet than the sides of the helmet. So this is to eliminate some of the ringing in the ears you'd get from being clonked in your helmet too frequently. Another feature they have are hinged cheek pieces. These allow you to fit the cheek pieces a lot closer to your jaw, and this provides jaw support that helps protect you from jaw breakage. This is a little bit heavier of a helmet. The neck protection isn't quite as good as in the Corinthian helmet, but it's a nice compromise between combat maneuverability, field of vision, and safety. And it's also fancier. The Pilos helmet we see early too. This first example on the left, this in here, is from the 5th century BCE, but this keeps on being used right on in through the Macedonian and Hellenistic period. This is a classic, and it's a helmet made to look a lot like a civilian hat, this kind of conical hat shape we see made in felt, and then the bronze variation is just the tank reboot of the felt soft-brimmed hat. And these can come with or without cheek pieces. They'd always have to be tied onto your head, and the cheek pieces are often either riveted on or hinged on, and this lets you replace them separately without having to replace the whole helmet. This conical top creates a nice protection against crushing and also deflects blows laterally, so this is a nice compromise of form and function, and much like the Chalcidian helmet, it doesn't cover your ears as much, so it eliminates that ringing effect without sacrificing safety. The brim protects the ears a little bit better than that Chalcidian helmet. So this is another classic. And we see all three kinds of helmets used by the time we get to the 5th century BCE pretty interchangeably. So a lot of this is going to be down to personal preference. At no time is there a uniform that everybody is wearing in an army. I have to say that because frickin' 300. No, Spartans don't always wear red, although there was a tradition for wearing red, but like not in any uniform way, and they don't all have a lambda on their shield. That's a much later thing that starts happening, well after Sparta's developed its brand a bit more. And in Athens, no, they're not all wearing blue. Just stupid movie franchise. Less said, the better. Okay. Now, although the shafts of spears don't survive very well, if at all, because they're made out of wood and wood rots, and it's been a couple thousand years, the spear points and the back end of thrusting spears do survive really nicely, because they're often made out of bronze in this period. Even though iron becomes available more and more as time goes on, bronze is still the metal of choice for the gear in the Hoplite Phalanx. We're looking here at a few surviving points that likely come from doroi. That's the plural of a doru. But you can see there's a lot of variation in how long they are. This one on the very end is broken off. Its tip is missing, and its back end with the socket is missing too. So this would have been almost like a dagger on the end of your thrusting spear. So this is a pretty extra one. And this continues to be a classic spear design right on through the Middle Ages. It's classic for a reason. But that's also going to be very front heavy and harder to use if you're a smaller warrior. So if you are smaller, you might want something a little bit more like this. This, like a lot of these spear points, is cast into a single socketed shape. We also see sheets of bronze that are curled around in a semicircle that allow you to kind of clamp it onto and off of the spear so that you can switch out your spear points as your shaft breaks, or if your spear point isn't the right spear point for the job, you can put another one on. The one on the very end may be a javelin tip. When we get into the smaller range, there's a little bit more interchangeability between a doru and a javelin, but these two on the left side here, let me do that in red so it's a little less messy, there we go. Those are likely from a doru. Now the other thing that makes a doru different from a javelin is its butt end. A javelin tends not to have a weight on the back end. Sometimes there'll be a little round bronze ball just to create a good counterweight, but most of the time it's just got the spear tip and it's made as light as possible because it has to fly when you throw it. But a doru has to have a good counterweight on the back end so that when you thrust it, you have a really good, strong transfer of force that can punch its way through the edge of a shield, and if you're very lucky, into the bottom of a cuirass too, so you can like get in underneath somebody's ribs. To do this, you have a lizarder or sauroter, which is essentially lizarder in Greek. Sauro is the same root that gives us the saur in dinosaur. It means lizard. The word in English for it is lizarder. The idea is that this is what you use to like spear a lizard for dinner after you've been fighting a long day on the battlefield. You just smash it down. So these are chunky, pointed butt tips, and you have them made like this for storage purposes. So at night when you go to sleep, you don't want to lay the wood of your spear onto the ground, especially if it's wet. That's going to cause your spear to warp and it'll make it unusable. Instead, you use the lizarder end, the sauroter, to stick it into the ground upright so it'll stay upright and the wood won't warp. This is a very long one. Next to it is this other lizarder that's a little bit more short and stocky. This also creates a heavy weight at the end so that even though you're holding, I'll use this candle for it. Okay, so here's a candle. Here's the spear tip. Here's the lizarder. So even though I'm holding it here, because it's got a weight at the bottom that's bigger than the weight at the front, the center of gravity is still going to be towards the back of the doru, so that when you thrust with it, it's going to stay on target, which is important. Here are a few museum pieces showing you what these look like when we dig them up. Some of them are in very sorry shape. At the very bottom, though, you see a collection of lizarders next to doru points, to give you an idea of the range. Each one of these is custom made, so they're going to be quite variable, and they're going to be sized to the person using them. This museum display is also nice because it's got half of a porpax. So this is the upper strap. This would be riveted onto the inside of your hoplon, and this is the part, the wide bit at the center, that would cuff onto your forearm. Here we have javelin points, and at the top maybe also some arrow points. So here are a few more pieces from a museum case. This is from the National Museum in Athens. And I've included in this find number 18 because you can see here how spear and arrow heads and javelin heads are made. This is the bronze that has been poured into a terracotta mold. You can see at the tips the open section where the bronze would have been poured in, and you'll notice that one of these has gotten a little warped. What's happened is that the mold broke before the metal cooled, so that as it flew apart, the metal warped. So the spear tips were these might be arrowheads. At any rate, these points are totally useless, so the whole blob got thrown out and they just started over again with a new one. But this gives you a great window into how these things are manufactured. And then at the top, you've got another one of these ginormous long doru heads. Now, as I mentioned, there are swords in use during this period, but these are for either personal protection when your line has broken or for hand-to-hand combat when your formation has cracked up. And they're used while you're still wearing your sword, or sorry, your hoplon. So your hoplon is still strapped to your shield arm, but you drop your shield and then go in with either your thrusting sword, your xyphos, which I've labeled here. So this leaf-shaped blade that's weighted towards the front is used mostly for stabbing, but also for slashing. You can use that curve in the leaf blade a little bit for shallow cuts. But if you really want to chop effectively, you use the second kind of sword, this kopis. The term is somewhat related to khopesh. And this is like a machete, so it's dull on this end, and it's sharp on this end, and it's weighted towards the middle so that you can really go in and hack. And apparently this fellow has been fighting somebody who also has a kopis, so you can see where he's gotten slashed in both of his thighs, right over the femoral artery, and he is bleeding out, looking heroically nude as he dies horribly, because aesthetics. You can see where heroic nudity has gone a little amok here. This artist has tried to have his cake and eat it too. You can see at the top, this guy's name is on the pot. This is Menelaus. It's Trojan War scene. And he's got his undertunic on with his cuirass. You can see there's his front breastplate. There would be a back plate on the edge. He's wearing his cloak, but he's got this transparent undertunic so that you can see his heroic nudity, but also he has padding, because this is how this culture views beauty standards. And that's the lovely thought I will leave you with. This is what we know and what we don't know and what we wonder and what we're confused by in the evidence coming out of archaic Greece. It's kind of all over the place. And even when we get into the 5th century, which is much better documented, right? We're going to be reading some of the histories coming out of the 5th century. Even then, what we see in the art is sometimes very challenging to match up with what we see in the written evidence. So something I'd like you to do as you do the reading for this week in Sage is to look for how people are talking about their tactics, their gear, their weapons, their armor, and what you're seeing in the art. What's matching up? What's not quite working for you? And what questions are you left with lingering? There I leave you. Have a good week, and I will see you back next week for the Persian invasion of the Greek mainland. Exciting.